Well, China's in the bad books, particularly in the United States, where Donald Trump has made it his life's ambition to stop every telecommunications company from ever using anything made by Huawei. By sheer coincidence, Huawei's revenue is more than double that of the US's Cisco, which is the second biggest provider of telecommunications equipment in the world. So that's $100 billion in revenue that Cisco could be grabbing hold of. But we're also told it's because of human rights abuses, and it's not just Huawei. So what happens if we trade less with China? What would that look like? And should we? And if we ditch China, should we also ditch trading with Saudi Arabia and Russia and Turkey and maybe the United States even? Are we hypocritical trading with China, or will we be hypocritical if we don't trade with China? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, the world trades with China. Of course, they exported $2.6 trillion worth of goods in 2018. They ship out finished products by and large, like phones and electronics. They ship in the raw materials like iron ore, oil, gas. Until a year ago, almost 20% of their exports went to the United States. Only 2% went to the UK. But that's still about $60 billion a year going to the UK. Australia, incidentally, imports almost as much, even though it's a much smaller population. But it's the other way that makes Australia vulnerable. More than a third of Australia's exports go to China. Over 70% of Australia's exports are minerals, and more than a quarter of that goes to China. So take China out of the equation, and Australia is stuffed, really. Less than 5% of the UK's exports go to China, so they'd cope. Exports to Europe are, after Brexit, is going to be a bigger concern for them. For the US, it's more than 8%, $1.4 trillion worth of exports, and some products are particularly vulnerable, like 20% of the $17 billion in soybean trade from the United States goes to China. So there's a lot of interest lying there. Is it too big a relationship for it to collapse totally, Steve?
Oh, China's, one thing you've got to take your hat off to over the last 30 years is the success of the Chinese Communist Party in doing capitalism. Because they have, when they made the decision under Deng Xiaoping to get rid of the Gang of Four, which for those who don't know is not a boy band, it was actually it was a
pretty ugly boy band.
Pretty ugly band. Well, a boy band led by a woman who was Mao Zedong's wife, and a very Stalinist, central planned, authoritarian approach to the economy. And Deng Xiaoping's policy was to innovate, and you didn't care whether it was a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice, was the slogan. And under that policy, their idea was to industrialize as rapidly as possible. And a major part of that was setting up free trade zones, the most important original one being in Guangdong province, the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone. And the idea was to attract American manufacturers with three purposes. One was to provide employment to the local workforce, which of course got already 100% employed, but in state factories and communes and so on, where the pay rates were lousy. So give them employment, bring in Western technology. Most importantly, start building the capitalist class in China. And I was very fortunate to be involved with the Australia-China Council back in '81. I spoke at a conference in Griffith University where one of the people in the audience was the Jocelyn Che, who was the chairperson of the Australia-China Council, and I spoke about the idea of issues-oriented journalism. The idea being that most journalism is reporting, the peasants are revolting. The peasants have burnt down this building. Never asking why did the peasants burn down the building. And
no, of course not.
What you do is you check out the issues. Like I said, journalism was event-oriented, not issue-oriented. And one way to make it more issue-oriented would be to look at coverage over the long term. So to go and look at newspapers and say, what did we cover in the last few days? And what the idea was to put together a year's worth of coverage of a country, another country overseas by its media, do the same with the other countries. So you have a year's worth of coverage, Australian coverage of China, a year's worth of Chinese coverage of Australia, and then break it down to the subject area and see what that looked like compared to and long-term journals like the Far Eastern Economic Review, and academic journals themselves, and see what issues were covered as well. So that was what took me to China back in December of 81. And we ended up going on a 3-week tour. We should actually talk about that conference, by the way. Maybe it'd be worthwhile thing for people to
you mentioned it from time to time on the podcast.
Let's do a podcast about it later. But anyway, we did a tour of China, and this was during the period when Deng Xiaoping was in power. The Gang of Four was actually being tried, and the trial was being broadcast live through speakers throughout Beijing. As we were walking around the town, of course, in Chinese, I couldn't understand them, but you non-stop listening to the trial of the Gang of Four. So we went to these various show communes all over the country, and one I remember was a furniture manufacturer in Sichuan province, and we got to the province which was manufacturing furniture, basically a Chinese version of IKEA, if you like, and they had this dramatic expansion of production in the factory over the previous year. And we asked them, how did you manage to achieve so many sales? And the answer, and I love this translation, said, we sent out propagandists.
I think marketing is the term these days. But
yeah, marketing. Okay, so where did the propagandists go to sell? And they ended up going they were selling 90% of their output to a state factory in Shanghai. So they were basically making orders for this damn thing, for a commune, making orders for a state factory. And I was looking at this, this is all going to fall over in a heap. It's not going to work. We finally get down to Guangdong province, go to the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone, and we got the most professional production of the public relations show that I'd seen in China the whole time we'd been there. And the guy who was in charge said, I'm going to introduce you to our main manager. Here's the guys mainly involved in planning the whole venue, so I'll hand over to him. And he then explained that there was some loophole, and I forgot what number it was, some element of the American trade law, which enabled a company not to pay import duty on goods that had been shipped overseas and from America to another country, third world country,
and had value added,
had work done in there and then ship it back. And so they were going to exploit that particular loophole so that an American company could do this and pay no tariffs. Back in the days when tariffs were 10 times as high as they are now, 30% rather than 3%. So they'd evade that tariff, and then they'd be able to take advantage of low-wage Chinese workers. At the time, Chinese workers, I don't know the exact figures, but they would have been paid as much a month as American workers were paid for a day or certainly for a week. So low wages, and get a huge increase in their profit margin. But there was a condition that came with, and that is that they had to have a Chinese partner, and within 5 years, the Chinese partner had to own 50% of the business. Yeah. Now,
so this is where all the knowledge transfer happens, isn't it? Which is why China's been so successful.
Well, twofold. Not just knowledge, but money as well. Because you own half a business that is making those sorts of profits, and you're a local Chinese, and you would have been a Communist Party member. You may have been a local industrialist, but more likely you're a Communist Party member. So you suddenly turn from a communist to a capitalist. It's huge cash flow coming in. That's part where the wealth comes from. But the third point you pointed, which I've been long-winded on the monetary one, technology. And they wanted American technology as fast as possible. And damn well they got it, and they then pull it apart and then be able to reproduce it themselves.
Now, back to my first question, whether the relationship is too big to collapse, because we have now, they are a massive trading partner for the whole of the world, and some countries like Australia particularly are very exposed to them as a trading partner. The UK perhaps a little less so. But look, they've been all over the news because of this new national security law in Hong Kong. But that is the tip of the iceberg. Incidentally, we could be, if we say something bad about China in this podcast, we could be susceptible to that new national security law as well. So you could be traveling through Hong Kong and you could be arrested. That's my understanding of it. It doesn't just apply to people.
I don't think it applies. Does it apply to foreigners are making negative comments. It might be about to Chinese nationals overseas.
I'm not sure. I'd heard that maybe
that's draconian. There's no two ways about that.
Either way, it's draconian, absolutely. And then, of course,
mind you, let's not forget there's a certain American law doing exactly the same thing, because there's an Australian citizen called Julian Assange in a British jail for breaking an American law. That is outrageous.
That is outrageous. So it's the same deal. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
If we're going to get the Chinese, then we bloody well get the Americans over Julian Assange.
Okay, we'll do another. Are we hypocritical trading with the US as well as China?
Bloody oath. Jesus Christ. There's an Academy Award for hypocrisy. America wins it.
Yeah, although the US doesn't have internment camps for Muslims like they do in Xinjiang.
Well, they've got Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah,
okay. Still got Guantanamo Bay, so let's not let them get away.
Yeah, that's true, maybe as well. The government's describing those in Xinjiang as vocational training centres, which makes them sound. But people protesting for human rights strangely disappeared in China. Twitter is banned, not necessarily a bad thing. It means. Imagine if they did that in the United States. What would Donald Trump do? But you know, the Communist Party pretty much has got control of the legal system as well. Donald Trump's trying to get control of that. He hasn't quite got that yet. But we still all trade with China. I take your point about the United States as well. So we. But I'm just wondering whether they're at the stage now where they're trying to push that little bit further because they know there's not a lot we can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly flexing their muscles dramatically. Because, I mean, by the way, I actually saw an amazing detail. George Orwell's father worked in a particular division of the British government. What division do you think it was?
Something to do with communications, propaganda?
It involves China.
Oh, okay.
It's a particular war of China.
Right.
He was in the opium department of the British government.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if people who don't know this particular detail, the Opium Wars were fought by Britain and the other colonial powers to maintain the right to export opium to China because there was nothing they themselves were manufacturing that China actually wanted to import in return for all the goods China was exporting at the time, all the porcelains and so on. So the British fought for the right to sell opium to China when China was trying to ban opium for the damage it was doing to the health of their own people. So, I mean, pardon me getting a bit vociferous here, but the whole idea of being moralistic about China, honestly, what we've done to China over the last 2 centuries, the West is in no position to be claiming moral superiority.
Well, but that was then. This is now. I mean, we can't always.
Oh yeah, let's forget the past. That's a great idea.
But you could go on. But you could go on forever. I mean, you know, there has been immense hypocrisy.
In other words, moral arguments are used for hypocritical reasons.
So there. And if you want to hear this podcast in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen. Go to debunkingeconomics.com and sign up there. Or become a supporter on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen to get access to this podcast in full and all the other ones in this series. Otherwise, we'll see you back here for the shortened version of the next one. I'm Phil Dobby. He's Steve Keen. See you next week. Thanks for listening.